Welcome, everyone. This is another session of the IBIS Prep crash course for the LSAT. And today we're going to continue doing arguments. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Everyone should be able to see this argument section. So I'm just going to go through it one by one and just kind of talk about thoughts. Hopefully we'll get through the whole test today. Well, the whole section at least. So the point that Acme Engines spent $500,000 relocating knee-level switches in its newer locomotives is offered in the commentator's argument as what? Well, let's read the argument. In last week's wreck involving one of Acme Engine's older locomotives, the engineer lost control of the train when his knee accidentally struck a fuel shutdown switch. Acme claims it is not liable because it never realized that the knee-level switches were a safety hazard. When asked why it relocated knee-level switches in its newer locomotives, Acme said engineers had complained that they were simply inconvenient. However, and here's the sentence, it is unlikely that Acme would have had spent the $500,000 it took to relocate switches in the newer locomotives merely because of inconvenience. Thus, Acme Engines should be held liable for last week's wreck. So what's the purpose of that sentence? It is unlikely that Acme would have spent the $500,000 it took to relocate switches in the newer locomotives merely because of inconvenience. It's to suggest that the reason they did it was for another purpose. And that other purpose most likely was because they actually did have knowledge of the safety hazard. So let's see. Proof that the engineer is not at all responsible for the train wreck. Sorry, I think I have someone saying they're joining. Sorry, yeah. Let me just add them. Okay. Proof that the engineer. Sorry. Welcome, Tamara, by the way. Proof that the engineer is not at all responsible for the train wreck. A reason for believing that the wreck would have occurred even if Acme Engines had remodeled their older locomotives. An explanation of why the train wreck occurred. Evidence that knee-level switches are not in fact hazardous. Or an indication that Acme Engines had been aware of the potential dangers of knee-level switches before the wreck occurred. That last one mirrors what I was saying when I read the passage. That the reason they use this sentence, that it is unlikely that Acme would have spent the $500,000 it took to relocate the switches in the newer locomotives merely because of inconvenience, was to imply what E is saying, indication that they had been aware of the potential dangers of knee-level switches before the wreck occurred. Any questions about number one?
No.
All right, let's try number two. The reasoning in the artist's argument is flawed in that the argument does what? So when we see these flawed arguments, our hope here is to identify the flaw before we look at the answer choices. Almost everyone in this country really wants to be an artist, even though they may have to work other jobs to pay the rent. After all, just about everyone I know hopes to someday be able to make a living as a painter, musician, or poet, even if they currently work as dishwashers or discount store clerks. Can anyone identify what's the flaw in that argument?
Is it that he's saying almost everyone in this country really wants to be an artist, and then he goes, everyone I know hopes to someday be able to make a living?
Exactly. You're comparing the country to everyone you know, and unless you literally are the president, or not even, you don't know everyone in the country. So when we see this where there's one population and then there's another population, they're being compared, what keywords are we usually looking for in the answer? Inaccurate representation, sample size is inaccurate, something like that. It has to be the representation or the sample size. It's a common error here. The error here is that you are making an assumption based on a small sample size of your friends and applying it to the nation at large. It's not a good representation. So, contains a premise that presupposes the truth of the conclusion, presumes that what is true of each person in a country is also true of the country's population as a whole, defends a view solely on the grounds that the view is widely held, bases its conclusion on a sample that is unlikely to accurately represent people in the country as a whole. That's perfect. Fails to make a needed distinction between wanting to be an artist and making a living as an artist. It's got to be D. D is what we were looking for. We identified the flaw perfectly there. Small sample size, making a conclusion on a large population is not going to be a good representation. All right, let's try this one. The QWERTY keyboard became the standard keyboard with the invention of the typewriter and remains the standard for typing devices today. If an alternative known as the D keyboard were today's standard, typists would type significantly faster. Nonetheless, it is not practical to switch to the D keyboard because the cost to society of switching in terms of time, money, and frustration will be greater than the benefits that would be ultimately gained from faster typing. The example above best illustrates which one of the following propositions. Often it is not worthwhile to move to a process that improves speed if it comes at the expense of accuracy. People usually settle on a standard because that standard is more efficient than any alternatives. People often remain with an entrenched standard rather than move to a more efficient alternative simply because they dislike change. The emotional cost associated with change is a factor that sometimes outweighs financial considerations. Maybe. The fact that a standard is already in wide use can be a crucial factor in making it a more practical choice than an alternative. E seems to be a strong answer here, right? Because D is saying emotional cost with change is a factor that sometimes outweighs financial considerations, but they said time, money, frustration would be greater than the benefits. So they weren't comparing financial considerations to emotional considerations. What they were saying is that the benefits that we ultimately gain from faster typing, what are the benefits? That is already in wide use, and that's a crucial factor in making it a more practical choice. It's not practical to switch to the D keyboard because the illustration is that it's already in wide use, and that's a crucial factor in making a more practical choice. So we agree with E for this one?
Yes.
Any questions? Yeah. All right. Let's see.
Yeah, I did E as well.
Excellent. Let's try this one. These come up a lot. When we have two people arguing against each other, we should always try to identify immediately what do they agree about and what do they disagree about. As simple as that. Sam, mountain lions, a protected species, are preying on bighorn sheep, another protected species. We must let nature take its course and hope the bighorn survive. Nonsense, says Melly. We must do what we can to ensure the survival of the bighorn, even if that means limiting the mountain lion population. So we can see what they disagree on is whether or not we should intervene or whether we should let nature take its course, right? Sam is saying we must let nature take its course. And Melly is saying we must do what we can to ensure, even if that means limiting the mountain lion population. That means intervening. So they disagree whether we should let nature run its course or whether we should intervene. A, humans should not intervene to protect bighorn sheep from mountain lions. Now, I really like that answer. I'm tempted to pick it, but I do want to look at the other ones. The preservation of a species as a whole is more important than the loss of a few individuals. The preservation of predatory species is easier to ensure than the preservation of the species preyed upon. Any measures to limit the mountain lion population would likely push the species to extinction. If the population of mountain lions is not limited, the bighorn sheep species will not survive. B, C, D, and E are not points of contention. The point of disagreement is whether or not they should intervene to protect the bighorn. A thinks that they should not intervene, whereas S thinks they should intervene, whereas S thinks that they should not intervene and that nature runs course, whereas M thinks they should intervene and do what's necessary to limit the mountain lion population. So we like A here?
Yes, I picked it.
Yeah. Let's try number 5. Which of the following can be inferred from the parent's statements? Ooh, okay. So inference questions mean we're going to read the argument and it's going to necessarily allow us to conclude something else. Pushing very young children into rigorous study in an effort to make our nation more competitive does more harm than good. Curricula for these young students must address their special developmental needs, and while rigorous work in secondary school makes sense, the same approach in the early years of primary school produces only short-term gains and may cause young children to burn out on schoolwork. Using very young students as pawns in the race to make the nation economically competitive is unfair and may ultimately work against us. So we're going to have to read these and see what we can infer from that. For a nation to be competitive, our secondary school curriculum must include more rigorous study than it now does. I don't know if we can infer what we must do to be competitive. It just says that in an effort to make, they push that in an effort to make us more competitive and does more harm than good, but there's no way we can infer what we need to do for a nation to be competitive. I don't really like A. The developmental needs of secondary school students are not now being addressed in our high schools. Well, the developmental needs of the primary students, it says, are not being developed, but curricula for these young students must address their special development needs, and while rigorous work in secondary school makes sense, so there's no way to really infer what B is saying, that the secondary school needs aren't being met, because they say that it's actually working, the rigorous curricula for secondary school, not for primary school. C, our country can be competitive only if the developmental needs of all our students can be met. Again, that seems like a good answer, but how do we know what is necessary for us to be competitive? That's not something that I really feel like we can draw from this. Maybe I'll hold on to A and C, but I don't love that. D, a curriculum of rigorous study does not adequately address the developmental needs of primary school students. I actually like that answer. Why? Because the sentence that says, curricula for these young students must address their special development needs, and while rigorous work in secondary school makes sense, the same approach in the early years of primary school produces only short-term gains and may cause young children to burn out on schoolwork. So that rigorous study, which in primary school results in only short-term gains and causing young children to burn out on schoolwork, can we infer that that means that it does not adequately address the developmental needs of primary school students? I think so, right? What about E? Unless our nation encourages more rigorous study in the early years of primary school, we cannot be economically competitive. E, A, and C are all tough to draw, because how do we know what's necessary for us to be competitive? We don't. We just know that if we push them to be more competitive in their primary years, it'll do more harm than good. And the reason why is because in primary school, that rigorous approach only produces short-term gains and may cause young children to burn out in schoolwork. The strongest inference is lack of long-term gains and burning out is synonymous with failing to adequately address the developmental needs of primary school children. So I like D in this question. Anyone have any answers that they like other than D? All right. Pauline, are you with us?
Yeah, I'm here.
All right. Do you mind reading this question number 6 and maybe just kind of talking through it? And if you need help, I'm more than happy to jump in.
Yeah, sure. A transit company's bus drivers are evaluated by supervisors riding with each driver. Drivers complain that this affects their performance, but because the supervisor's presence affects every driver's performance, those drivers performing best with the supervisor abroad will likely also be the best drivers under normal conditions.
Right. So we have a situation here where drivers are being judged by supervisors, but when drivers have their supervisors on board, they drive differently. So we can assume they're drawing that because the supervisor's presence affects everyone, that we can still determine who's the best driver based on these results. What's a necessary assumption? It might not be obvious, but let's read through them, right? There's no effective way of evaluating the bus driver's performance without having supervisors ride with them. The supervisors are excellent judges of a bus driver's performance. For most bus drivers, the presence of a supervisor makes their performance slightly worse than it otherwise would be. The bus drivers are each affected in roughly the same way and to the same extent by the presence of the supervisor. The bus drivers themselves are able to deliver accurate assessments of their driving performance. Do any answers jump out to us?
A, I will say.
There's no effective way of evaluating the bus driver's performance without having supervisors ride with them. I mean, I see how you could arrive at that answer because, you know, if this way is bias, then we have to assume that there's no other way because
Correct.
yeah, I don't hate that argument, but I think there's a stronger argument we can make. Right? I think D, the bus drivers are each affected in roughly the same way and to the same extent by the presence of the supervisor. Right? Because this is the way I think about it. If you have a situation where I am proctoring, actually, let's make a different example. You have a situation where we have boxers and they spar. Spar is like practice boxing, and in sparring, we're judging them. But it's very much a true statement that sparring and real boxing, when the lights are on and the crowd is there and the TV's on, are totally different things. So our assumption now is based on how people do in sparring, we could judge how they're going to do in real boxing. Now, what's the flaw of that argument? What I just said. How do we know that people are going to do the same in practice as they do in the real thing? Well, their attempt at rectifying that is by saying, well, everyone does differently in practice than they do in the real thing. So therefore, it's fair to judge people in practice, and that'll give us an adequate reflection of how they'll do in reality. Now, the assumption has to be that everyone is affected the same way, because isn't it very true that some people might do really well in practice, but they do terrible on game day? Other people, they're not really practice players, but on game day, they step up to the, moment and they shine. If that were the case, then it wouldn't be fair to judge them the same because, A and B, A does terrible in practice, but does great on game day. B is the opposite. So we're not going to be able to fairly judge them based on practice. Now, if D were true, that the bus drivers are each affected in roughly the same way and to the same extent by the presence of their supervisor, then we would adequately be able to draw that conclusion. 6 to me is like a bad argument that can only become a good argument if we draw this conclusion, which I think is a difficult conclusion to draw, right? So it makes sense though, right? We have this scenario where the bus drivers are all affected by the supervisors, but because they're all affected, we can still judge their performance, and that'll be an adequate reflection. The necessary assumption is that they're each affected in roughly the same way and to the same extent by the presence of the supervisor. Because if some people are affected differently by the presence of the supervisor, then when the supervisors are removed, it wouldn't be a fair measurement. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes, that makes sense.
All right, let's try number 7. I'll read this one. Which of the following is most strongly supported by the information above? Okay, so for this one, we have a scenario where There's information above and it's going to support information below, right? Like whatever they say is going to support information below. Now, a problem with these types of questions, I swear, is that people make conclusions using outside information. That is not what they're asking you to do. Don't make a conclusion that's true based on things you know from the outside world. I don't know if that's going to apply to this question. I'm just saying I've seen that pattern where people are like, oh, well, B is true. I'm like, yeah, but you only know that because you watch Game of Thrones. You don't know that because of the argument that was given. So make sure when you're doing these by the information above questions, you are only using the information above. Look at these questions in a vacuum as an island. Economic growth accelerates business demand for the development of new technologies. Economic growth accelerates business demand for development of new technologies. Okay. Businesses supplying these new technologies are relatively few, while those wishing to buy them are many. Yet an acceleration of technological change can cause suppliers as well as buyers of new technologies to fail. So we see what's happening here. They're saying that, technological advances accelerate demand, for new technologies, and the suppliers are in higher demand than the buyers because everyone wants to buy the new technologies, but not that many people can make them, right? So what happens though is unfortunately acceleration of technological change can cause suppliers as well as buyers of new technologies to fail. It's kind of an anomaly, right? You would think that new technologies would cause them to do well, but it can cause them both to fail. So let's see what's supported by this. Businesses supplying new technologies are more likely to prosper in times of accelerated technological change than other businesses. I don't love it. Businesses that supply new technologies may not always benefit from economic growth. I do like that because it literally says in the last sentence, yet an acceleration of technological change can cause suppliers as well as buyers of new technologies to fail. And who are the suppliers of these new technologies? What B is saying, businesses that supply new technologies may not always benefit from economic growth. An acceleration of technological change, which is a result of economic growth because economic growth accelerates this, could result in those suppliers' businesses to fail. B is strongly supported. C, the development of new technologies may accelerate economic growth in general. Again, C is one of those answers that perfectly illustrates what I was saying earlier. That is true using outside information. It is true that the development of new technologies may accelerate economic growth in general, but we can't really draw that from here. All we know is that it increases demand and then sometimes they fail. There's nothing from the passage to suggest that it accelerates economic growth in general. It just accelerates demand for the development of new technologies. D, businesses that adopt new technologies are more likely to prosper in a period of general economic growth. Again, probably true, but not true from the passage. There's nothing from the passage that suggests that businesses that adopt new technologies are more likely to prosper in a period of general economic growth. And then economic growth increases business failures. Again, too difficult to draw. B, we can concretely, definitively draw. Why? Because it says an acceleration of technological change can cause suppliers as well as buyers of new technologies to fail. And what causes an acceleration of technological change? Economic growth. So B, businesses that supply new technologies, suppliers of those technologies may not always benefit from economic growth. They sometimes fail despite economic growth. Does that make sense why the answer is B there?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. 7 is B. Okay. Let's try number 8. Tamara, do you mind reading this question?
Okay, I go. It's energy analysis. During this record-breaking heat wave, air conditioner use has overloaded the region electrical power grid, resulting in frequent power blackouts throughout the region. For this reason, residents have been asked to cut back voluntarily on air conditioner use in their homes, But even if the request is heated, blackouts will probably occur unless the heat waves abates.
So which one of the following of true most helps to resolve the apparent discrepancy? So we need to know here, what's the discrepancy? Well, the discrepancy is that there's air conditioning use is causing the grid to overheat, to black out. So they're telling people to stop using their air conditionings, but even so, the blackouts will continue. What would resolve that? Air conditioning is not the only significant drain on the electrical system in the area. That's a pretty good answer, right? Because if other things were causing it to drain, then reducing air conditioning maybe wouldn't stop the blackout. So hold on to A. Most air conditioning in the region is used to cool businesses and factories.
Nothing.
You don't like that answer?
No.
I actually love that answer.
Wow, you're kidding. Okay, wait.
I'm not kidding. I'm serious. Paulina, do you know why I love that answer?
Well, it's a little bit more than like the first one. It gives like an example, maybe kind of like it's giving more businesses and factors in that region instead of like a general statement of saying like not the only significant drain on the electrical system.
Well, did anyone catch it? This one is, it's one that'll fly over your head if you don't catch it. For this reason, residents have been asked to cut back voluntarily on air conditioner use in their homes. So residents in their homes. But B is saying that most air conditioning in the region is used to cool businesses and factories. So we have these blackouts that are a result of overuse of air conditioning. We're telling people to stop using air conditioning in their homes, but it's still not going to do anything. Why? Because most of the air conditioning is actually industrial. It's in businesses and factories. So residential discontinuation of air conditioner is going to have a minimal effect. A is a good answer, but it literally says in the first sentence that air conditioner use has overloaded the electrical power grid. So why would A resolve it? It really wouldn't. It would kind of like maybe give an explanation, but B gives a great resolution of, okay, so right. I know it's one of those answers. It's one of those answers that looks terrible until it looks great. You know what I mean? But the answer there is because it's businesses and factories, and this is residential. Let's look at C. Most air conditioning systems could be made more energy efficient by implementing simple design modifications. Residents of the region are not likely to reduce their air conditioner use voluntarily during particularly hot weather. The heat wave is expected to abate in the near future. B is such a good answer. We really want to look for these answers that are specific to something in the fact pattern that would resolve it. And this one, you had to catch it. They said that they cut back on residential use in homes. Well, it would not resolve it, and it would make sense if all the air conditioner overuse was occurring industrially in factories and businesses. Okay. I'm going to read number 9, and I want to see, by the way, I want to see if there's any way to make me. Oh, I think that'll work. Okay. No, never mind. I was going to see if I can make me the picture, but I'm going to read number 9, and I want someone to tell me if they can just tell me. Actually, I thought number 9 was going to be a flaw. It's not. Number 9 is which of the following, if true, most weakens the argument. So here we're going to have to consider A through E and see what would weaken the argument. But usually you can frame these in a sense that like you're looking for something that would weaken the argument, and you could find something that fits that frame, if that makes sense. Maybe we'll be able to do that here. Long-term and short-term relaxation training are two common forms of treatment for individuals experiencing problematic levels of anxiety. Yet studies show that on average, regardless of which form of treatment one receives, symptoms of anxiety decrease to a normal level within the short-term training time period. Thus, for most people, the generally more expensive long-term training is unwarranted. Which of true would most weaken the argument? So the argument is long-term training is unwarranted. Why? Because people go through long-term training and short-term training when they have anxiety, and no matter what you do, your anxiety is reduced in the within the short-term training period. There's no reason to stay in the long-term period because your anxiety is reduced, unless, of course, there is a reason to stay in the long-term period. That's what I'm thinking off the bat, that there's going to be a reason we should stay in the long-term training, because the short-term training, even though anxiety is reduced, there's still a benefit of staying in the long-term training. Did everyone see that? How that would probably be something that would weaken the argument?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. A decrease in symptoms of anxiety often occurs even with no treatment or intervention by a mental health professional. That has nothing to do with short-term versus long. It has to be something that explains what's great about long-term. Short-term relaxation training conducted by a more experienced practitioner can be more expensive than long-term training conducted by a less experienced practitioner. Maybe, but I don't love it. Recipients of long-term training are much less likely than recipients of short-term training to have reoccurrences of problematic levels of anxiety. Absolutely. That is a benefit of long-term training, is that you don't relapse. There's less reoccurrences. So yes, you're healed just as quickly in short and long term, but you want to stay in long term to prevent relapse. That's why it would weaken the argument. Is long-term training unwarranted? No, it's warranted. Why? Because staying in long-term gives you better odds of not having relapses, or what did they say? Recurrences. I like C. D, the fact that an individual thinks that treatment will reduce his or her anxiety tends in and of itself to reduce the individual's anxiety. D is not the correct answer, but I want everyone to understand what D means. D means the placebo effect. That could be an answer to a different question that you're not considering. Like maybe considering that the white powder people are sniffing is making them feel crazy, even though there's nothing, special about it. That's a consideration.
Or
But it's
maybe,
not the
I'm sorry. Or maybe if there's like a flaw as well, like trying to like say, what's the flaw in this? And you're not thinking about like the placebo effect or something like that. I don't know.
exactly. Good flaws could be placebo effect. Correlation does not necessitate causation. We did the sample size earlier. Unreliable surveys, like unreliable information. A lot of different flaws and arguments. That placebo could be a flaw, but for this one, we're looking at C. I think that long-term training prevents reoccurrences. And then E, short-term relaxation training involves the teaching of a wider variety of anxiety combating relaxation techniques than does long-term training. That would strengthen the argument. Like if short-term training was better than long-term, then why would anyone do long-term? Okay, let's try number 10. And Paulina, if you can read this one, and when you read it, just tell me, because it says, which one of the following most accurately expresses the conclusion of the argument? Just tell me when you have found the conclusion, which sentence, as you read it, sounds like the conclusion, and then we'll try and find it.
Okay. Many critics of consumerism insist that advertising persuades people that they need certain consumer goods when they merely just desire them. However, this accusation rests on a fuzzy distinction that between wants and needs. So that's the conclusion, because it says why in life it is often impossible to determine whether something is merely desirable or whether it is essential to one's happiness.
The conclusion is, as you said, this accusation rests on a fuzzy distinction, right? That's what they are firmly saying. Because when you say that, you're going to say, why? Why do you think that accusation rests on a fuzzy distinction? Because in life, I think he's about to give an Al Pacino speech from this movie. Okay, so A, the claim that advertising persuades people that they need things they merely want rests on a fuzzy distinction. Yes, that's the answer, right? Because This accusation, what accusation? The claim that advertising persuades people that they need things that they merely want, rests on a fuzzy distinction. The answer is A. B, many critics of consumerism insist that advertising attempts to blur people's ability to distinguish between wants and needs. C, there's nothing wrong with advertising that tries to persuade people that they need certain consumer goods. D, many critics of consumerism fail to realize that certain things are essential to human happiness. And E, critics of consumerism often use fuzzy distinctions to support their claims. E is the trap answer because it says the word fuzzy distinctions, but it has to be the accusation rests on a fuzzy distinction. What is the accusation? The claim that advertising persuades people that they need things that they merely want. The answer is certainly A here. All right. 11, I think, is going to be hard. Why do I think 11 is going to be hard? Because it's a necessary assumption. And necessary assumptions can be very difficult for people to grasp because it's like sometimes you know what the necessary assumption is, you just don't know how to articulate it. Like, oh, no, of course, I needed to know that. I knew that. But how did I know that I needed to know that? Kind of that conversation. I always think of this logic as circular. The necessary assumption is the last 25% of the circle. You go from A to B, B to C, C to D, and now you got to go back from D to A. I might have messed up the percentages there, but point being is it's the last little piece that's going to tie everything together. So if there's something they tell you at the beginning and then they conclude something at the end and they don't exactly align, or they seem to align, but they maybe use different terminology, the necessary assumption has to be that they are related, or that by arriving at this terminology, that equates to arriving at the original terminology. That does happen a lot. So let's look at number 11. People who browse the web for medical information often cannot discriminate between scientifically valid information and quackery. Sorry. I didn't know it would do that. I didn't know you could call me on this. Okay, sorry. People who browse the web for medical information often cannot discriminate between scientifically valid information and quackery. Much of the quackery is particularly appealing to readers with no medical background because it's usually written more clearly than scientific papers. So they're saying people who browse the web for medical information can't discriminate between scientifically valid information and quackery. Much of the quackery is particularly appealing to readers with no medical background because it's usually written more clearly than scientific papers. Thus, people who rely on the web when attempting to diagnose their medical conditions are likely to do themselves more harm than good. I think this one is actually reinforcing what I was predicting. They kind of arrived at a conclusion that we have to assume is what they began with. They began with people who browse the web for medical information cannot discriminate between scientifically valid information and quackery, and they arrived at they do more harm than good, right? They do themselves more harm than good because they rely on the web when attempting to diagnose their medical conditions. So the assumption has to be people who attempt to diagnose their medical conditions do more harm than good because they cannot discriminate between scientifically valid information and quackery, right? It has to tie those things together. Did I lose anyone there?
No, perfect.
Okay. I kind of lost myself, but let's see which one it may be. Which one of the following is an assumption that argument requires? People who browse the web for medical information typically do so in an attempt to diagnose their medical conditions. We don't need to assume that. People who attempt, people who attempt to diagnose their medical conditions are likely to do themselves more harm than good unless they rely exclusively on scientifically valid information. That's actually a good one. People who attempt to diagnose their medical condition are likely to do themselves more harm than good unless they rely exclusively on scientifically valid information. Because if they're not relying exclusively on valid information, what does it imply? They're relying on quackery. I like B. Hold on to B. People who have sufficient medical knowledge to discriminate between scientifically valid information and quackery will do themselves no harm if they rely on the web when attempting to diagnose their medical conditions. It's not the assumption we're really looking for. Many people who browse the web assume that information is not scientifically valid unless it's clearly written. It's not it. People attempting to diagnose their medical conditions will do themselves more harm than good only if they rely on quackery instead of scientifically valid information. Okay, we have two contenders here, right? I think we all agree, B and E. Can anyone distinguish or let me know which one they think is stronger between B and E?
I think B is stronger.
Yes, B is stronger. Why is B stronger than E?
Well, because I don't really like the only if they rely on quackery instead of scientifically valid information, like because I kind of put the negation of it and just like made more sense to go with B.
Totally agree that B is saying unless they rely exclusively on it, and E is saying only if they rely on quackery instead of scientific valid information. E is not true because there's other ways they can do more harm than good. It's not only if they rely on quackery, it could be if they rely on duckery, I don't know, but like anything other than quackery. Like it could be other ways. But B is saying that if they unless they rely exclusively on scientific valid information. So if they rely on quackery or anything else, then they'll do themselves more harm than good. B allows us to arrive at the conclusion where E, it's too specific, where it forces you to assume something that you don't have to assume, where B is a necessary assumption. I think difficult, but manageable. All right. Let's try number 12. And for the nature of time, I might just start reading them because I do want to see if we can get through the whole test. It'll be fun. When adults toss balls to very young children, they generally try to toss them as slowly as possible to compensate for the children's developing coordination. But recent studies show that despite their developing coordination, children actually have an easier time catching balls that are thrown at a faster speed. So why would they have an easier time catching balls thrown at a faster speed than a slower speed? Let's see. Balls thrown at a faster speed, unlike balls thrown at a slower speed, trigger regions in the brain that control the tracking of objects for self-defense. That seems to make sense, right? Like it's a reason why balls at a faster speed, unlike a slower speed, are more easily caught. Balls that are tossed more slowly tend to have a higher arc that makes it less likely that the ball will be obscured by the body of the adult tossing it. That would be the opposite, right? If it was less likely, slowly, they would catch the slow ones. Adults generally find it easier to catch balls that are thrown slowly than balls that are thrown at a faster speed. Children are able to toss balls back to the adults with more accuracy when they throw fast and when they throw the ball back more slowly. It's not about when they throw, it's about when they catch it. There's a limit to how fast the balls can be tossed to the children before the children start to have more difficulty in catching them. I really like A here. A is an explanation about why. If balls thrown at a faster speed, unlike balls thrown at a slower speed, trigger regions in the brain that control the tracking of objects for self-defense, then it would be a reason to resolve that paradox of why they actually catch it faster. They catch it when it's faster. We all agree with A here?
Yeah. Also, none of the other ones make sense.
Yeah.
I do have a question.
Sure.
I thought because we were talking about children, so I wanted to find an answer that will explain that in children. So for me, A, I didn't pick it because it was too broad.
Yeah, I like that. You're looking for children, but we all have brains, so it's still applicable. It does say why it would be slower, and it would be a reason why children or adults in general would catch it. Whereas C doesn't apply because it says adults generally find it easier to catch balls that are thrown slowly than balls that are thrown at faster speed. Even if it said the opposite, adults generally find it, that's apples and oranges. But A is applicable to children. Children's have brains and they're triggered.
It will be like a principle? No.
Yeah, it would be like a principle.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're gonna say something? I thought you were gonna say something. Okay. All right, let's try the next one. The following statements above, if true, most strongly support which one of the following? Like a genetic profile, a functional magnetic MRI, like a genetic profile, an MRI of the brain can contain information that a patient wishes to keep private. An MRI of a brain also contains enough information about a patient's skull to create a recognizable image of that patient's face. A genetic profile can be linked to a patient only by referring to labels or records. So here we have a situation where the MRIs are showing you the face of the person, but the genetic profile is only showing you enough that you would still need their records or labels. Okay. So which is most strongly supported? It is not important that medical providers applied labels to MRIs of patients' brains. I don't think we can conclude that. An MRI has the potential to compromise patient privacy in circumstances in which a genetic profile would not.
Yeah,
I kind of like that
it.
one, right? Yeah, we all like that one. Literally, we love that one because it shows the face, whereas the genetic profile does not. In most cases, patients cannot be reasonably sure that the information genetic profile will be kept private. Most of the information contained in an MRI of a person's brain is also contained in that person's genetic profile. Can't really deduce that. Patients are more concerned about threats to privacy posed by MRIs than they are about those posed by genetic profiles. Again, we can't conclude that. We can definitely conclude B because it shows the face and the genetic profiles don't. All right, let's try number 14. A questionable technique used in the council member's argument is that of blank. So we're looking for structuring here. I recommend that the abandoned shoe factory be used as a municipal emergency shelter. Some council members assert that the courthouse would be a better shelter site, but they have provided no evidence of this. Thus, the shoe factory would be a better shelter site. So here's a flawed argument. We have options A and B. Well, the people arguing for B don't have a good argument, so it must be A, right? That's a bad argument. Just because the people arguing for B failed to argue for B doesn't mean we fall on A, right? So A, asserting that a lack of evidence against the view is proof that the view is correct. A lack of evidence against the view is proof that the view is correct. Not exactly, right? Accepting a claim simply because advocates of an opposing claim have not adequately defended their view. That one is more correct, right? We're going to accept Y because people defending X did a bad job defending X. We have to accept Y. That's what he tried to do, and that's not something that we're going to be comfortable doing. Attacking the proponents of the courthouse rather than addressing their argument, attempting to persuade its audience by appealing to their fear, and attacking an argument that's not held by any actual council member. The answer is definitely B. B says we have X and Y. You guys had a bad argument for Y, so we have to go with X. That is a flawed technique. All right, here we have another necessary assumption. It was misleading for the argument relies on which of the following assumptions. It was misleading for James to tell the core curriculum committee that the chair of the anthropology department had endorsed his proposal. The chair of the anthropology department had told James that his proposal had her endorsement, but only if the draft proposal she saw included all the recommendations James would ultimately make to the core curriculum committee. So what's the conclusion? That it was misleading to tell them that the chair endorsed it. And why? Because the chair told James that they would endorse it only if the proposal she saw included all the recommendations that James would ultimately make. So the assumption is that it didn't, right? It didn't have all the recommendations, and that's why it was misleading to say that they endorsed it. If the chair of the anthropology department did not endorse James' proposed recommendations, the core curriculum committee would be unlikely to implement them. The chair of the anthropology department would have been opposed to any recommendation James proposed to the core curriculum committee other than those she had seen. James thought that the core curriculum committee would implement sorry. I figure out how to stop that next class. James thought that the core curriculum committee would implement the proposed recommendations only if they believed that the recommendations had been endorsed by the chair of the anthropology department. James thought that the chair of the anthropology department would have endorsed all the recommendations that he proposed to the core curriculum committee. The draft proposal that the chair of the anthropology department had seen did not include all the recommendations in James' proposal to the core curriculum committee. That was a classic example of I predicted what was going to happen. It said it was misleading, and then it said it would only be, endorsed if it included all of the recommendations. So if it was misleading and it would only be solid if it included all the recommendations, the assumption is it didn't include all the recommendations. And those ones are tough because you read A, B, C, and D, and you're like, oh, Lord, I hope it's E. But E did fit the bill there, where E was the assumption that we came up with. All right, let's continue on. We might not finish all of them, but we'll get through some tough ones. I usually think that this page is the toughest, 16 through 19. For whatever reason, I feel like it peaks around here and then kind of plateaus in the 20s. 1 through 10 is a lot easier, and then I think these ones are tough. So let's try number 16. Which of the following, if true, most weakens the argument? T Corporation has recently hired employees with experience in the bus tour industry, and its executives have also been negotiating with charter bus companies that subcontract with bus tour companies. But T has traditionally focused on serving consumers who travel primarily by air, and marketing surveys show that T's traditional consumers have not changed their vacation preferences. Therefore, conclusions coming up, T must be attempting to enlarge its consumer base by attracting new customers, right? So what would weaken the argument? The conclusion that they're trying to enlarge its consumer base by attracting new customers. And why do we conclude that? Because they've traditionally been focused on, consumers who travel by air, and they haven't changed it. And now they're getting into the bus industry. So the thing that would weaken is something that would tell us why they got into the bus industry that wasn't related to attracting new customers, right? In the past, T has found it very difficult to change its customers' vacation preferences. That has nothing to do with weakening the argument. Several travel companies other than T have recently tried and failed to expand into the tour bus business. Still doesn't explain it. At least one of T's new employees not only has experience in the bus tour industry, but also designed air travel vacation packages. I don't love that. Some of T's competitors have increased profits by concentrating their attention on their customers who spend the most on vacations. Profits by concentrating. Again, I don't love C or D. The industry consultants employed by T typically recommend that companies expand by introducing their current customers to new products and services. Absolutely. They're not trying to get new customers. They're trying to introduce their current customers to new products and services. That's why they got new bus employees. Everyone agree with E?
Yes.
That was a tough one, but we arrived at it.
No, I thought it was easy.
I
Okay.
actually think it was that bad. Well, because it's like, you know how it says like many does not equal most, and it's like some does not equal most. At least one was like not really a great option,
Yeah.
and then several was not a good option. The first one wasn't that good, so I was like, okay, yeah.
Yeah. I think maybe it was tough because when you're doing that process of elimination and you eliminate A, B, C, and D, it's like, okay, E better sound good, or I'm gonna have to go back from the beginning. So maybe it wasn't tough. It was just
No,
it
but
was
that's
just E.
yeah.
Yeah. It wasn't tough, it was just E. All right. Let's try 17. The educator's conclusion follows logically of which of the following is assumed. So for these ones, we have to a necessary assumption. It's like I said, we're 75% around the circle. It's probably going to be something that links the end to the beginning. Okay. traditional classroom education is ineffective because education in such an environment is not truly a social process, and only social processes can develop students' insights. In the traditional classroom, the teacher acts from outside the group, and interaction between teachers and students is rigid and artificial. Okay, so what's the assumption here? That it's ineffective, right? Because it's rigid and artificial, and it doesn't truly lead to developing their student insights, right? See, the educator's conclusion, which is that traditional classroom education is ineffective because education in such an environment is not truly a social process. Only social processes can develop students' insights. Only social processes can develop student insights, and this is ineffective. In the traditional classroom, the teacher acts from outside the group, and interaction between students and teachers is rigid and artificial. I feel like it has to do with something that develops students' insights that would lead to this conclusion. Development of insights takes place only if genuine education also occurs. Classroom education is effective if the interaction between teachers and students is neither rigid nor artificial. All social processes involve interaction that is neither rigid nor artificial. Education is not effective unless it leads to the development of insight. The teacher does not act from outside the group in a non-traditional classroom. I think it's between B and D, right? Unless anyone has any other contenders. B, classroom education is effective if the interaction between teachers and students is neither rigid nor artificial. D, education is not effective unless it leads to the development of insight. So we need to lead to the development of insight. Traditional classroom education is ineffective because education in such an environment is not truly a social process, and only social processes can develop students' insights. And education is not effective unless it leads to the development of insight. In a traditional classroom, the teacher acts like it describes it. I think the answer is D.
Yeah, D.
D, right? Because
D. Yeah.
D is in dog. Education is not effective unless it leads to the development of insight. Because if it leads, that's why it's an issue that's not a social process, because it needs to be a social process because it needs to lead to the development of insight. If it's not a social process, it doesn't lead to development of insight. And if it doesn't lead to development of insight, then it would be ineffective education. Okay, let's try two more. I know I said I wanted to get through them all, but I only have time for two more. The reasoning in the argument is most vulnerable to criticisms on which of the following grounds. Okay, so let's just find the flaw of this argument. The probability of avoiding heart disease is increased if one avoids fat in one's diet. Furthermore, one is less likely to eat fat if one avoids eating dairy foods. Thus, the probability of maintaining good health is increased by avoiding dairy foods. There's a lot of flaws with this argument, right? What are some that anyone could think of?
Maintaining good health is not the same thing as avoiding heart disease.
Yeah, I like that. That like
it's all kind of relative, but not really like in this, life of stimuluses and all of that. That's not really like the best answer or best.
Yeah, and I'm thinking from a practical sense, like, okay, dairy, it does add fat, but it also helps your calcium and your bones and stuff, right? So like, just because something, has a thorn doesn't mean that its benefits don't outweigh its negatives, kind of, right? Like they're saying, maintaining good health is increased by avoiding dairy foods, but what if dairy foods actually promote good health? They just also make you a little bit fatter. I mean, I think that's actually true. Like, I don't know. It used to be when I was growing up. They changed the food pyramid, but it used to be. The argument ignores the possibility that even though a practice may have potentially negative consequences, its elimination may also have negative consequences. That kind of is exactly what I was saying, actually, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I like that answer already. Let's see. The argument fails
If I
to
was doing the test and running out of time, I will choose A and move on.
Yeah,
That's a good strategy.
absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely a good strategy, but only when you're running out of time, and the best thing to do is to practice enough that you don't run out of time. I know that sounds crazy, but if you've done practice tests, do them over again. It can be the same test, but start practicing that speed element so that you really don't feel like you're running out of time at the end. 1 through 10 should be quick and easy to give you a lot of time to do these last ones. But absolutely, if you're certain of the answer and you're running out of time, pick it. If you have time, it's best to look through the other ones. But here, I agree. A sounds great. The argument fails to consider the possibility that there are more ways than one of decreasing the risk of certain types of occurrence. The argument presumes, without providing justification, that factors that carry increased risk of negative consequences ought to be eliminated. The argument fails to show that the evidence appealed to its relevant conclusion asserted. The argument fails to consider that what's probable will not necessarily occur. Definitely A. It ignores the possibility that taking away dairy is worse than keeping dairy. All right, and then this last one, we're just going to learn how the professor's argument proceeds. One cannot frame an accurate conception of one's physical environment on the basis of a single momentary perception, since each glimpse occurs from only one particular perspective. Similarly, any history book gives only a distorted view of the past, since it reflects the biases and prejudice of the author. So it's, without being, super high level and keeping it rudimentary, it gives one argument and then makes a comparison to another, right? It gives an argument and makes Okay.
It's an analogy.
Analogy, exactly. It's just an analogy. The professor's argument proceeds by attempting to show that one piece of reasoning is incorrect by comparing with another presumably flawed piece of reasoning. Now, it does compare two pieces of reasoning, but the first one isn't flawed. The first one is sound, allegedly. Developing a case for one particular conclusion by arguing that if the conclusion were false, absurd consequences would follow. No, some arguments do develop this way, but not this one. Making a case for the conclusion of one argument by showing that argument's resemblance to another presumably cognate argument. Very well stated. Arguing that because something has a certain group of characteristics, it must also have another closely related characteristic. Arguing that a type of human cognition is unreliable in one instance because it's been shown to be unreliable under similar circumstances. I would say this might be the easiest question we've done all day. This one is C. They gave us an argument and then they made a comparison. So, this test is in the drive. You can definitely finish 20 through 26. We'll continue doing more arguments. Next week, I'm probably actually gonna do a reading passage, which I know isn't like the most fun thing, but I think it is a necessary thing. So the course has been humming along. I hope everyone has found it valuable, and I really appreciate the people who are here participating today.